He starts with theology, and then he uses that to reinforce his practical teaching later on in his letters. And we're dealing with a lot of practical things today. And I'm so glad, because if there's one thing that I want to know today, it's how to live in the kind of society that we live in. We need to know how to live and how to live in a wise way, because I almost feel like today we're tiptoeing around landmines. And it's so easy to say something that's going to cause some kind of conflict. It's so easy to offend people. People are offended by everything. And I want to know how to live in a way where I'm promoting peace without compromising the truth. So we want to promote peace, not just for the sake of peace, but we want to promote peace because we're called to do that in Scripture. And that's so difficult to do these days with how sensitive and easily offended people are. So we're going to begin today in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're going to start in verse 2 today. Paul says, "Make room for us in your hearts. We wronged no one. We corrupted no one. We took advantage of no one." If you remember a few weeks ago, I talked about the fact that Paul's writing to the Corinthians, and one of the things that he says is that the Corinthians lacked affection or love for him. That's why Paul says, make room for us in your hearts. Paul said earlier that you are restrained in your own affections. He said that in 2 Corinthians 6:12. In other words, Paul loved the Corinthians, and he loved them dearly. He actually called them his own children. He loved them so dearly, but his love wasn't reciprocated. They didn't love him back the way that he loved them. And Paul's addressing that. Paul's sort of calling them out on that. And the first thing I want to say today, and I don't think there might not be any more appropriate command to follow than this one in our day and age, and that is that Christians have to love those who don't love them. Love those who don't love you. Paul loved the Corinthians. They didn't love him back. At least most of them didn't. He loved them dearly, and he did so much for them. He spent so much time with them. He invested so much in them, and they didn't have the same kind of love for him. He loved them anyway. Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He said that in Matthew. And in Luke chapter 6, that's kind of the parallel to Matthew chapter 5. And Jesus adds a lot to that. Give to those who are ungrateful. Bless those who persecute you. And this is not easy to do. We hear these commands and we go, wow, that's impressive. And we kind of just leave it at that. We know these are pretty lofty commands, but I honestly believe most people think they don't really have to do this. And part of the reason is because it's hard to do. It's hard to love your enemies. I want to add something to this, because obviously you might be thinking to yourself, well, when I say enemies, I mean those who are outside the church. People who are not Christians. But actually, enemies can be found both outside the church and inside the church, unfortunately. Dallas Willard said, you don't have to go far to find your enemies because they're in your church. Now, I'm not saying that anyone's an enemy here, but I'm speaking generally. Sometimes your enemies are inside your own church. That's possible. I hope these cases are rare, but it is possible. Actually, remember, the Corinthians some of them considered Paul an enemy. And remember when Paul said, we wronged no one, we corrupted no one, we took advantage of no one. The reason he says this is because they were accusing him of all this. They looked at him as an enemy. So sometimes, and this is terrible that it's this way, sometimes enemies can be found in the church. And what I found, and you can agree or disagree, but this is my perspective on this. What I found is that it's easier to love unbelievers when they mistreat you than it is to love believers when they mistreat you, because believers should know better. If an unbeliever mistreats me, okay, no big deal. I can live with that. But when a believer does, that's something different. Because believers are held to a higher standard. We're in the same spiritual family. So that's something entirely different. This is something entirely different. I expect to be mistreated by unbelievers, but I have higher expectations for those in the kingdom of God. And unfortunately, we are sometimes mistreated by our fellow believers, but we're still commanded to love them. And actually, the Bible's pretty clear on this. You should have a special love for believers. You should have a special love for people in your own spiritual family. You should love other believers so much that the world should see it and go, wow, I've never seen anything like that before. We're called to that. So how do we do this? How do we love people like this? How do we love our fellow Christians this way? And of course, this doesn't only apply to Christians, it applies to everybody. But how are we to love in this way? It's important to point out first that the word love that Jesus used, it means actively doing what the Lord prefers. Actively doing what the Lord prefers. In other words, Jesus is not commanding us to feel a certain way toward people, but to act a certain way toward them. Notice Jesus said, pray for those who persecute you. He didn't say, have warm feelings toward those who persecute you. He said, you're to pray for them. You're to love them by treating them a certain way, by acting a certain way toward them. I will say that love does include emotions. It can. Love does include affection, having affection for people. That's true, but love isn't limited to that. God is a reasonable person. He really is. God is a very reasonable person. And God doesn't expect us to have warm, fuzzy feelings towards someone who's abusing us. We're not called to do that. We're not called to have those kinds of feelings toward people. But we are commanded to act a certain way toward people. And you can't really control how you feel, but you can most certainly control how you act. So God expects us to be responsible for what we can control, not what we can't control. Jesus said, of course, pray for those who persecute you. In Romans 12, verses 20 through 21, Paul wrote, but if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Overcome evil with good. We've heard all this before, but it's time to put it into practice. You're not going to overcome evil with more evil. You're not going to make a crazy person think rightly by talking crazy to them. You're not going to put out a fire if your hose is filled with gasoline. It's not going to happen that way. You overcome evil with good. If someone's insulting you, how do you respond? You bless them. If someone tries to steal from you, what do? Well, maybe you give them some help, financial aid or some other kind. This is interesting. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln often visited the Confederate soldiers, and he gave them food. And one of the Union soldiers asked him, "Why are you giving food to the Confederates? They're our enemies." And Abraham Lincoln replied, "I destroy my enemy by making him my friend." That's what we need to do. You don't overcome evil with more evil. You overcome evil with good. And you're not going to change people's minds on the other side by making fun of them. I think that is something that we have become so guilty of in our day and age. You know what we would do well to do is not get our morals from Facebook. We don't need Facebook wisdom. We don't need that. It's if you're and I've actually been pretty good about this. I was going to say I struggle with this. I actually don't struggle with this. I can boast that I'm actually very good at this. I'm really good at controlling what I put on Facebook, because what I've found, I've learned this from the mistakes of others. What I found is that Christians, of course, are usually conservative people. And they think to themselves, well, I'm going to fight the good fight, and I'm going to stand for what I believe by making fun of people on the other side. And they post all these highly offensive things, and really it's just about how dumb the other people are. That's usually what the message is. The message is, I'm smart and you're stupid. Listen, do you think you're going to change anybody's mind by doing that? It's highly unlikely. It's highly unlikely. There's a way to speak the truth that promotes peace. There's a way to speak the truth that probably will yield better results. And you don't even have to make fun of anybody. We need to be very careful with our words, be careful with the message that we're trying to tell people. Be very cautious about that. A lot of the time, it's not necessarily your words that will win people over, it's the spirit that you speak them in. And you have to speak the truth. I'm not saying that you don't speak the truth. I'm not saying to just, keep silent and let people believe evil things or crazy things, but I'm saying there's a way to go about this. Treat your enemies with love. Treat them with respect. A lot of people want to be respected. You treat people with respect. In 2 Corinthians 7:3, Paul says, I do not speak to condemn you, for I have said before that you are in our hearts to die together and to live together. Paul says, I don't speak to condemn you. Because Paul defended himself earlier in 7:2, the church probably thought that he was condemning them for their accusations against him. Remember, the church accused Paul of all sorts of things. However, Paul had no desire to condemn them. Instead, he wanted to prove to the Corinthians that he loved them and that he was worthy of their affection. We need to evaluate our motives. We need to evaluate our motives. Before you speak, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. But you see, I never think before I speak. Practice that. Before you speak, think about what you're going to say. Make sure that you're saying it for the right reasons. Let me give you an example. Never say anything in order to get revenge. Never say anything in order to get revenge. If someone says something hurtful to you, you don't say something hurtful back. And this is kind of, it's funny, I'm hearing myself say this, and I remember hearing all this as a kid. I never put this into practice as a kid. Never. And now I'm an adult, and I don't want you to think I'm like talking down to you. I don't, because I feel like a parent, like giving their kids instructions. So don't think that I'm talking down to you when I say this, because I apply all this to myself, or at least I really try. Think before you speak, and make sure that when you do speak, you're saying things for the right reason. Don't say things to get revenge. Never rebuke somebody unless your motives are pure. You know what I found also? What I found is that before I speak to people, I really try and make sure that I'm not angry. Sometimes before you speak, you need to make sure that your anger kind of, calms down a bit. Because if I speak when I'm angry, usually I'm going to say things that either I don't mean, or I'm going to regret, or all the above. So sometimes the best thing to do when you're angry is to just do nothing and say nothing. When you're angry, let yourself calm down. Give yourself some time to think. Give yourself some time to process what's going on, and then speak. Make sure your motives are pure. By the way, and I have to point this out, it's so important to note that the Bible never condemns judging. I know everybody thinks that. They're wrong. The Bible never condemns judging at any point. And I'll prove it to you. Matthew chapter 7. And people know verse 1, but they don't know the rest. Matthew 7, verse 1, and you know the verse by heart. Jesus said, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged." And they just shut their Bible and they go, "See? Don't judge. Under no circumstances should you judge." Is that what Jesus meant? Of course not, because there's more to what he said. Notice in verse 2, "For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Here's what he's saying. He's saying, if you have something that you need to address in your own life, until you address that, you have no business pointing out the faults in other people. And if you do that, that's called hypocritical judging, and that's what Jesus is condemning here. The Bible condemns hypocritical judging, not all judging. Hypocritical judging is wrong. And actually, remember what Jesus said, if you have a fault and you point that same fault out in someone else's life, you're condemning yourself, because what you're saying is, I know that's wrong and I'm doing it. You need to first, there's a way to go about this. You examine yourself. If there's a fault that you're struggling with, you repent. You correct that. And then after you've corrected it, then you'll be able to address the fault in somebody else. Jesus never said, don't worry about the speck in your brother's eye. He just said, worry about the 2x4 in your eye first. This needs to be done a certain way. We need to avoid hypocrisy. Avoid hypocrisy. The Bible does not condemn all judging. As a matter of fact, in John 7:24, Jesus said, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." You can judge, but just do it righteously. Do it the way that the Bible says. So it's not wrong to point out a person's faults, but it must be done with the right motives and in the right spirit. If you come off as condemning, then it's not going to be received in the right way. This has a flip side to it, as most things do. This has a flip side. And the next one's very, very difficult. It's so easy for us to point out other people's faults. The next one's very difficult, and that is we need to learn to accept correction ourselves. Oh my goodness, can you imagine if everyone learned to do this? Can you imagine the results if everybody learned to accept correction? I mean, think about how our society would change if people actually stopped and thought, you know what, maybe I've got some things wrong. Maybe I'm not always right. This would change our society. And I'm not just saying unbelievers need to do this. I'm saying Christians need to do this. And actually, maybe Christians are the only ones that can do it. We need to learn to accept correction. Accepting correction is very important. In Psalm 145:1, David wrote, "Let the righteous smite me in kindness and reprove me. It is oil upon the head. Do not let my head refuse it." David says, if a righteous person corrects me, I'll happily receive it. If I need to hear something, if I need to be corrected, if I need to be reproved, fine. I'll receive that. You know what I find interesting about David? People always talk about how sinful David was, and we know the sin that David committed. He had Uriah murdered. He committed adultery with Uriah's wife. It was a terrible thing, and it cost David dearly. But you know what I noticed about David is, as bad of a sinner as David was in that situation, David was an incredible repenter. And David was somebody who could accept correction. Remember, after all that happened, Nathan the prophet came to David, and Nathan basically told David, hey, you've done some serious wrong here. And rather than getting angry, and rather than being offended, what did David do? He accepted the correction and he repented. And after he repented, his relationship with God was kind of restored again. So David was a sinner, yes, but he was also a great repenter. I love what Proverbs 9:8 says. It says, "Do not rebuke mockers, or they will hate you. Rebuke the wise, and they will love you." There are certain people that just cannot accept rebuke. And if you rebuke them, or if you try and correct them, they'll hate you. Because they're not wise enough to accept correction. Actually, being able to accept correction is a sign of godly wisdom. A wise person is not someone who always has all the right answers. A wise person is someone who's willing to hear godly wisdom from somebody else. They realize they don't have all the wisdom they need, and they need to hear it from other people. Be humble, be wise, and be willing to accept correction. If someone corrects you, consider their words. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But consider what they have to say. Maybe they're wrong and they shouldn't even be saying what they're saying. But maybe they're right, and maybe you could benefit from listening to their words. When Peter was acting hypocritically, I talked about that a couple weeks ago. Peter was acting like a hypocrite. He was basically showing favoritism to Jews and sort of neglecting Gentiles and not treating them as he should. And Paul called him out. Paul rebuked him for that. And you know what I love about Peter? Is Peter was so humble about this. Because if you read the second epistle of Peter has two epistles. If you read the second one, he talks about Paul after this event. He's not talking directly about this event, but he's talking about Paul after the event. And you remember what he says? He says, Paul is our beloved brother. He wasn't bitter toward Paul. He wasn't offended. He didn't melt when Paul said this. He accepted the correction, and he loved Paul. He wasn't bitter or angry about it. So I think that's great. We need to accept correction. And as I'm saying this, you're making a list of things I need to improve on. I know this is hard to do. It's hard to accept correction because you got to be humble. And you know what it is too? Is you have to really want to change. You have to really want to change. You have to hunger and thirst for righteousness. If you hunger and thirst for righteousness, then accepting correction is not going to be so bad. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 7:4, 2 Corinthians 7:4, he says, "Great is my confidence in you. Great is my boasting on your behalf. I am filled with comfort. I am overflowing with joy in all your affliction." Great is my confidence, Paul says. This is a little bit tricky because it can be worded a couple different ways, but the ESV says, "I am acting with great boldness towards you," which means Paul spoke freely and openly to the church when he said that the church lacked love for him. So what Paul's saying is, I value our friendship so much, and I have confidence in our friendship and confidence that you'll do the right thing. And that's why I spoke so openly and boldly to you. That's why I was so blunt with you when I said that you don't love me as you should. The ability to speak openly with a person is a sign of true friendship. We need friends in our lives who are going to be open and honest with us. If you're around somebody, if you have a friend who is just flattering you all the time, they're not a genuine friend. Actually, people who flatter other people are manipulators. Flattery is basically just manipulation. We need friends who love us, friends who are willing to be honest with us, and friends who will tell us if we're in the wrong. I love what Proverbs 27:6 says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy." Sometimes the most loving thing to do is to rebuke somebody. But this has to be done very, very carefully. Because when you rebuke somebody, you need to do it in a very gentle and loving way so you don't appear like you're trying to be superior to that person. Have you ever realized that we're experts when it comes to how other people should live, but we can be so ignorant about how we ourselves should live? I'm an expert on how everybody else should behave. But when it comes to myself, sometimes I lack that same expertise. We're scholars when it comes to other people's faults, but we're kindergartners when it comes to our own. We know exactly how everyone else should act. Sometimes we don't know how we should act. Our natural tendency is to be very critical of others and very gracious to ourselves. Is it not? We're very gracious to ourselves. Actually, everyone is a very gracious person. You know that? We all have a lot of grace for us. But we need to extend that same grace to other people. So when we're correcting people or when people are correcting us, however it goes, it needs to be done not in a harsh and condemning way, but in a gentle and loving way. Again, I can't emphasize this enough, sometimes it's not what people say, it's how they say it. Sometimes people will respond to you in a positive way, not because of the words you used, but because of the spirit in which you spoke them. That is so important these days. It's always important. It's so important. I used to think years ago when I had everything figured out, I used to think, boy, if I just really tell them the truth, if I just really let them have it, boy, they'll just listen to me. They'll really turn around. And I found out you just can't do that. The Bible says, speak the truth to love, not scream the truth in love. And I just didn't get that for a long time, and finally the light bulb came on. Galatians 6:1 says, "Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness." each one looking to yourself so that you too will not be tempted. Do this in a spirit of gentleness. When you talk to somebody and you're correcting someone, that person should get the impression that you really do care a lot about them. That you're saying this not just to assert some kind of authority. You're not saying this to appear superior to somebody, but you're doing this because you truly care about that person. There should be no doubt that you care about them or they care about you. And notice that when you're correcting someone, always remember that you are capable of making the same mistake they did. When you correct somebody, always have this in your mind, I could have done that same thing. That keeps us humble. When we correct somebody, we should always have it in our mind, I need this correction too. I need this warning too, because that might have been me. When you correct somebody, always do it for the purpose of restoration and never for the purpose of condemnation. If your motives are pure and your spirit is gentle and humble, then I think a person will be more inclined to receive your words. This has never been needed more than today, because you can say one thing, one little thing that'll trigger somebody. Now, having said that, as everybody knows, sometimes you can say all the right things and still make people mad and offended. Sometimes people are going to get offended no matter what you say. Don't worry about that. If people get offended no matter what, well then there's nothing you can do. But if they're offended because you're saying things in the wrong way and in the wrong spirit, then that's something that you need to correct and you need to watch out for. And this applies in so many areas of our lives. I'm not talking about just people on the other side of the political aisle. I'm talking about friends. I'm talking about family. I'm talking about coworkers. I'm talking about people at the grocery store, people at the gas station. I mean, this applies in every area of our lives. We need to apply these Pauline principles. So important that we do this. And again, I just have to emphasize the fact that you have to be prepared in advance to behave this way. You can't just hope that when the situation arises, you're going to do the right thing and have the right spirit. You have to prepare yourself in advance to behave this way, to treat people this way. You have to do this. You have to think about this. Give your life some thought. Give your motives some thoughts. You need to examine yourselves, and you need to ask yourself from time to time, not every single day, but ask yourself from time to time, why am I doing what I'm doing, and why am I saying what I'm saying? Am I saying this to love people, or am I saying this just to make the person look bad? So much news now. You ever notice this? The news is never about just reporting the truth of anything. The news is always about making the other side look bad. Always. There's no exceptions anymore to this. Every news story that's presented now, unless it's the weather, every news story is all about this is the truth and this is why the other side is dumb or something like that. Always. Don't have that same spirit. Now, I'm going to be cautious how I say this. Guys, I share stuff on Facebook. I talk to people too. I'm not saying don't share anything. I'm not saying never talk about political things. I talk about this stuff too. I post stuff on Facebook sometimes too. I'm not saying don't do that. But what I'm saying is think before you do it. Think very carefully before you do it, and make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Someday we're going to be judged. And one of the things that the judgment is going to reveal is motives. Did you know that? You know how I know that? Remember what Paul said? And this verse makes the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. He really does. 1 Corinthians 4:5, therefore do not go on passing judgment before the time, that is, before the judgment, but wait until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the things hidden in the darkness and disclose the motives of men's hearts. And then each man's praise will come to him from God. Notice, the judgment is not just about what you do, it's about why you did it. God weighs the motives, Proverbs says. Make sure that you're doing things for the right reasons, because God cares also about why you're doing it. Give this some serious, serious thought. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.